friends, welcome to the series Issues in World History 1 20th Century. In the earlier lecture on the League of Nations, we talked about the origins of the League of Nations and the various bodies or the constituents of the League of Nations and how these bodies like Assembly, etc., they played an important role within the framework of the world affairs. And today we will talk about that how the various incidents or issues which happened during the times when League of Nations was in operation, how they impacted the world and how League of Nations played an important role in terms of resolving a number of issues which were brought to her notice. And over a period of time, we also see that in many of the incidents, League of Nations could not play that kind of a role where it could resolve the issues, and which also led to, in the sense that the Second World War could be seen. So we will talk about the other works of the League as well, that how League was also involved in a number of humanitarian works and how the bodies or the commissions and committees which were associated with the League of Nations, they played an important role in humanitarian work as well. And it is also very important when we tend to see the context of that particular period, that how immediately after the First World War, when the Allied and the Axis powers they ended the war, and we find that the Treaty of Versailles was seen to be some kind of a dictated peace where the victors or the Allied nations they in a way treated Germany in such a manner that Germany was feeling offended over a period of time. And League of Nations, initially we see that Germany was not allowed to join the League of Nations, and thereafter it joined as well, but it was not really in a way interested to be the part of the League of Nations. In the context of the references, one can refer to Mastering Modern World History by Norman Love, James Joll, Origins of the First World War can also be seen, and A.J.P. Taylor's First World War Struggle for Mastery in Europe can also be referred in terms of the readings, apart from the source material which is also available from IGNOU with regard to the League of Nations can also be seen. When one talks about the origins of the League of Nations, we find that it was a product of the Treaty of Versailles which was signed in 1919, and how League came into operation in 1920. And the headquarters of the League were in Switzerland, in Geneva, and we find that when you talk about the objectives of the League at that point of time, how the conflict, the First World War was seen by the world, and it was an imperative kind of a concern that how one has to maintain the world peace at that point of time, and this could only be achieved when various kinds of nations they were cooperating with each other, and how they were also concerned with the security of each other without resorting to any kind of a war in those times. And as we discussed in our last lecture with regard to the principal organs which were in a way attached with the League, for example, Assembly, Council and Secretariat, and the kind of functions which they performed. And two other important bodies were the Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labour Office, which was associated. These were the two bodies which were also associated with the League as well. When we see the developments of that particular period, we find that how League was involved in a number of useful works during that time, and for nearly 20 years we find that League was in operation, and how it was in a way asked to examine around 40 disputes in which League got engaged. One of them concerned with the islands, and an important achievement was the issue of the islands, and these islands lay between Sweden and Finland, and how Finland and islands they once belonged to Sweden, but those were acquired in 1809 by Russia. And we see, when we tend to see the developments of these times, we find that in 1917 Finland declared her independence, which was recognized by Sweden in January 1918. but now both they claimed the islands, which largely had inhabitants of Swedish stock, and they spoke Swedish language as well. So when this kind of an issue which reached the League of Nations, so the decision went in favor of Finland, and how these kinds of developments which were happening at that point of time, the people of Ireland were guaranteed autonomy and the protection of their political rights. We also see that the rights of the private property and the use of Swedish language in the schools were to be preserved as well, and they were also given local self-government as well. So these were some of the important concerns of that particular period regarding Ireland islands, and these were being taken into consideration during the times of the dispute as well. And we find that both the parties, how they accepted the decision of the League, and it was a great step in the peaceful settlement of the international disputes, because when such kind of decisions which were taken by the League and which were being accepted by the parties which were in a dispute, then it also sent a clear message to others as well, that how international disputes they could be resolved by some kind of a mediation by a body, and others would also follow suit in that sense, and it would provide some kind of positive message to others as well, that if they have any such kind of disputed ideas or some kind of a disputes which need to be resolved, then they can approach that kind of a body which was available now in the framework of the League of Nations. So in this context, one has to understand the importance of the League of Nations, and one has to also realize that how it also engaged itself in other issues of the world, including Upper Silesia, where we find that the peace treaties raised the boundary problems, and it was for the League of Nations to settle the international border between Germany and Poland to important industrial area of Upper Silesia, and League decided to partition it between the two nations. So one has to also understand that how when League was making this kind of an interference, and this interference was on the request of these nations, those who were following the decisions of the League, and how they had signed treaties as well, where they had to, in a way, when they joined the League of Nations, they had to abide by the rules and regulations of the League of Nations, and the court which was part of the League of Nations, they had to follow the decisions of that court as well. So this was an important step, keeping in mind the volatile times, especially after the First World War, and we also see that situation from the economic point of view also deteriorated during the late 20s, when the world economic crisis happened as well. Apart from this, we also see that the Mosul boundary dispute was also one of the issues which was seen during this time, and it was being provided in the Treaty of Lausanne, and this treaty was signed between Turkey and Britain, and that the frontier separating Turkey from Iraq was to be drawn in a friendly manner but between Turkey and Britain, and if no agreement was arrived at within 9 months, the matter was to be referred to the League. And we find that both the nations, they claimed Mosul province, which had rich oil deposits. So in that framework, we find that economic consideration of both these nations in terms of acquiring those rich oil deposits was one of the main concerns. And we find that the interference of the League in this particular matter, where it decided that the Brussels line was to be permanent boundary line between Turkey and Iraq, and it was also being suggested that the Britain was to take steps to secure the extension of her control over Iraq for a further period of 25 years. And it was also seen that how the minority rights, they were to be protected in a manner, and the League was conscious regarding it as well. And we find that the Kurdish minority in Mosul was guaranteed the appointment of Kurdish local officials and use of their language in its schools. And Britain and Iraq, they accepted the decision, but Turkey was not ready, and it refused to accept the decision. and there were also concerns, because when we see the international relations and how international relations move, and the concern and of all the nations in that context is to secure their own national interests. In this context, how various countries, they change their positions, keeping in mind their own interests at different points of time. So, we see that Turkey, because of its own interest, in a way was now began to lean on Soviet Union, and Britain entered into a compromise during this time, by which Turkey was given some royalties from the Mosul oil fields, and this dispute was amicably settled, in a way solved. And we find that when this dispute was solved in this manner, it also raised the prestige of the League of Nations, that it was a body which was taking required kind of steps, and was conscious of the kind of issues which were there between the nations, and it also realized its responsibility, that once it will be able to resolve such kind of disputes, then the international peace and security would prevail. Apart from this, there were other issues, as we have given you, that there were 40 disputes which were being referred to the League of Nations, and the dispute between Greece and Bulgaria was one where we find that there was some trouble on the frontier between Greece and Bulgaria on the account of some shooting which happened. And we find that in October 1925, commander of a Greek frontier coast and one of his men, they were being killed, and in retaliation a Greek army marched into Bulgaria, who appealed to the League of Nations. And we find that when League intervened, it asked Greece to withdraw its troops, and finally over a period of time we find that they were being withdrawn as well, and Greece was also asked to pay the compensation to Bulgaria for violation of a treaty on a scale to be fixed by a commission appointed by the League of Nations. So, we find that such kind of interventions, where League could also realize that the aggressor party has to be in a way reined in, they have to be given some kind of a punishment. In that sense, they have to be in a way controlled in a manner that any small issue may not escalate into a situation of war, because we have seen that during the First World War, how small incidents in different regions, they created a situation for a whole scale war. So, League was very conscious of that particular thing, and that is why we find that it was ready to make such kind of interventions and inroads with regard to the kind of decisions which were taken at different levels in different countries. We also see that how one of the litmus tests for League was seen in the incident of Corfu, and how an international commission to settle Greco-Albanian boundary line had been sent to Balkans, and the 4 Italian members of this commission, a general, 2 officers and 1 chauffeur, they were being murdered on Greek soil. Mussolini was the Italian dictator who demanded apologies and full compensation for crime as well. We see that how when a League intervened in this particular matter, Greek was not ready to accept all the demands of Italy, and how we find that Italy occupied the island of Corfu in September 1923. And when this matter was referred to League, we find that League was not able to in a way directly intervene against the defiance of a powerful nation like Italy, and so the conflict in a way we find that the conflict was in a way turned over. It was being given to a council of ambassadors, and Greece was asked by this council to pay Italy an amount of 5 crore lire or lira. And we find that when this kind of an amount which was to be given, 5 crore of lira was to be given to Italy by Greece, and we find that when this kind of an amount was being given to it, then Italy withdrew from Corfu, and League of Nations in a way succeeded in avoiding a war. Yet Italy was able to defy League in this sense. It was portent of failure to follow. So, we find that how League was in a way trying to settle the issues which came to it in different manner, and how League had some kind of a mechanism by which it was trying to communicate to the warring parties that how they had to maintain peace, which was an important concern, and how they had to learn from the lessons of the First World War, where different kinds of tensions between these regions led to a full scale war. Apart from the kind of issues which were being referred to the League in the framework of the conflicts which were happening among these countries, we also find that League was also engaged in other works as well, and how it made some kind of a commendable success on the exchange and the repatriation of 500,000 prisoners of war. So, from that point of view, we find that it was making some sort of a social work in which League was also involved, and we also see that how it protected from a certain starvation 1,000,000 people in Greco-Turkish War of 1921-22. So, in this sense, we find that apart from the political issues, League was also engaged in non-political issues as well, where we find that the health and the humanitarian work was also being taken up by the League. And it was important from the point of view in a framework that how it paid attention to the perfect hygienic techniques to lessen the epidemics in various nations. So, League in that sense promoted the study of causes and the control of diseases like cancer, smallpox, anthrax and tropical maladies, and it undertook measures to control traffic in dangerous drugs and provided relief and rehabilitation for those who were affected by any disaster in any part of the world. So, we find that the health concerns in those times, they were also very important, and League realized that these kinds of maladies or these kinds of health issues or various kinds of diseases, they needed some kind of a concerted effort by some kind of a world body which had some kind of funding as well. So, it engaged itself in that particular sense as well, that apart from providing the humanitarian relief, some kind of medical interventions in the framework that in that particular field, we find that they wanted to control various kinds of diseases, and how we see that the traffic in the dangerous drugs in terms of smuggling etc. Was also being seen, and League wanted to interfere in that particular issue as well. Apart from that, we also see in terms of publications, whether the books or the periodicals on the national and the international issues, we find that League also made some kind of concerted efforts as well in how it aired the important health information from its own radio stations. So, we find that League was playing an important role from this particular point of view, where dissemination of information was seen as an important concern of those times, and through books and periodicals, and apart from that we also see that radio stations, they were also playing an important role in terms of dissemination of the information. And we find that health organization was especially successful in fighting a typhus epidemic in Russia, which at one time appeared to spread across Europe. So, that was one of the important kind of a contribution which League was making, apart from in a way maintaining the world peace, where different kinds of incidents which could have led to a warlike situation could be avoided because of the intervention of the League. And in this series, we also find that disarmament was one of the concerns of the League, because we had seen that how during the First World War and even before that, how there was a race for armaments in the different countries of the world. They were competing against each other to increase their armaments. So, we find that these kinds of armaments which were there, they needed to be reduced, because if the armaments will not be reduced, then they can also lead to war. And that in this particular context, we find that in this particular case, Lee could not make much progress in this direction, especially in 1930s, when we see that more and more countries, they were increasing their armaments, And also we find that it appeared to be some kind of a prejudice, because League of Nations was created by the victors or the allied powers, and many times we find that the allied nations, they were not being kept in check in terms of increasing their weapons, and the defeated nations, they were being in a way forced to maintain their particular stock, and they should not increase the number of weapons which they have. And we find that how Russia made a proposal for the complete disarmament, but none other members we find did not pay attention to this particular issue. And this kind of a neglect of this the issue of disarmament over a period of time led to that how countries, they also increase their armaments. And when we see that the way Germany was treated in the Treaty of Versailles, and how it was being disarmed through the various provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, on the other hand, other countries, they were not being forced to disarm themselves, and so this led to some kind of an acrimony as well. And we find that there was a conference called Washington Conference, which was a positive step in this direction. And England, USA and Japan agreed to keep capital ships in the ratio of 5-5-3, 5 units each for USA and England and 3 for Japan. And we also see that how France and Italy, they were allotted a ratio of 1.7. And we find that the conference was criticized on the ground that it dealt with larger ships, but excluded the smaller naval units like light cruisers and destroyers. So in this particular sense as well, we find that some kind of a discriminatory treatment was being given to the countries which were defeated by the victorious nations. And in this particular way, we find that this kind of a treatment to Germany and even a victorious nation like Italy, for that matter, created some kind of disquiet, some kind of a dissatisfaction among the population of these regions, which were being utilized by Hitler as well as Mussolini in terms of starting, or in a way initiating the Second World War. We also see that other conferences, they were also being held at that point of time, in Geneva in 1927, London in 1930, but they were not able to make much progress in this regard. And we also see that other nations like England and USA had problems over their relative cruiser strength, and Japan did not adhere to ratio decided at Washington. And we also see that how these countries, they were making some kind of gains on the diplomatic front as well, and how the French Prime Minister Bryant, along with Kellogg, who was the Secretary of State of USA, they declared that war would be announced between USA and France. And Kellogg urged England to extend pact to all great powers at that point of time, and in 1928 15 nations, they signed this pact. Although Kellogg-Bryant Pact stated for renunciation of war as a tool of national policy, there were no provisions for enforcing this treaty. So we find that different kinds of agreements, they were being signed at that point of time, but how these agreements, they were to come in operation was also to be seen during this time. And we also see that 1929 was also a period when you have the world economic crisis, the Wall Street crash, and different countries of the world, they came into a lot of economic pressure during this time. And we realized that how USA started some kind of plans, and how these kinds of plans, they were associated with the economic kind of assistance to diverse nations. And Young Plan in 1930, it reduced the amount of reparations to be paid to the allied nations, and the allied nations, they were withdrawn from Rhineland 5 years before the stipulated time mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles. And a plan for a union among European nations, being called Federal Union, was also proposed. So we find that Young Plan also came up during this time, and how the amount of reparations which were to be paid during this time by Germany to the allied nations, they were to be reduced, because Germany itself was in a very precarious situation from the economic point of view. and we find that the Allied forces who had occupied Rhineland, they also had to leave Rhineland 5 years before the stipulated time, which was there in the Treaty of Versailles. And we also see that there was a plan for a union among the European nations, which was to be called as a federal union, was also proposed in this. So, when we talk about the various kinds of interventions which were made by the League of Nations during this time, we find that League was able to do some kind of a commendable job in terms of restricting various countries, so that their situation does not escalate into a war. And it was also a first time that an international body which had so many members, those who in a way were committed to the objectives of the league, they were there, but at different points of time we also see that these members, they flouted the rules of the league as well, which ultimately could be seen in the framework of the failure of the league finally, which led to the Second World War. So, in this sense we find that the failure of the system of collective security could be seen, and how league could not succeed on the political front on a number of occasions where it failed as well. And it not only in a way reflected badly on the image of the league, but we also find that it led to it being a non-entity as well. And in the dispute between the Egypt and England, league did not arrive at a fair conclusion as well. So, we find that in a way different kind of different kinds of interferences which were made by a league at different points of time, not all of them they were successful, which also reflected in some kind of a failure as well. In the next discussion we will talk about the kind of other kinds of activities with which league was associated, and we will also talk about the other issues, other interventions which were made by the league. Thank you very much.